One fly popcorn bucket and a 5-month delay later, we finally have Dune Part 2. 2 years and 6 months after the first, we are finally back in Arrakis. I mean, Dune Part 1 was delayed to hell and back. Dune Part 2, basically the same treatment. And I have no idea what's going to be happening with Dune Messiah, but for what this film is, just hours after seeing it, I can say that on a sci-fi level, this might be the greatest thing man has ever created.
I am Paul Atreides, Duke of Arrakis!
And Dune Part 2 is directed by one of my favorite directors, honestly top 3 directors of all time for me, Denis Villeneuve, and it's being led by one of my favorite actors in their 20s, Timothée Chalamet. And to put it simply, this has been my most anticipated movie for the last 2 years. And as you can tell, even though the bar was sky high, this film surpassed almost all of my expectations. Now stay tuned till the end of this video for my final score, because I've done a lot of debating and I am very up and down about this film, but I want to start off by talking about the visuals. Now normally I think it's okay to group the craft of a film together, but there's no way I can do this movie justice if I just umbrella all of these brilliant elements together. But before we get into it, while I give my thoughts on Dune Part 2, if you've seen it or want to check it out, let me know what you think about it in the comments down below, and let me know which one you think is better, Dune Part 1 or Dune Part 2. Both don't waste any more time, let's get into it. Like I said, I want to start off with the visuals because this is shot by cinematographer Greig Fraser, who also did the first Dune film along with The Mandalorian Season 1, The Creator, Rogue One, and my favorite of his work thus far, The Batman. And I don't think it's crazy to say, but I think of the modern filmmakers, Greig Fraser is easily the most technological, innovative. I think that he brings so many new things to the element of cinematography in film. Not just a flair that he has, but just literally being inventive with the technology at his hands. Now, I will say I'm going to praise him a lot, but I do have one big problem, which I'll get into in just a second here. But I want to start off by talking about the infrared scene in this film, because I think it's absolutely brilliant. Now, I have spoken to one of my friends who is a big enjoyer of the Dune novel and the Dune books as a whole, so I got to understand the best of both worlds. I got to understand the visual elements that could be taken from the book, and what I was told by him was that the infrared scene, the Colosseum scene that's in this film, was much bigger and much more grand in the book. Now again, though I don't have firsthand experience with the book, I do believe the visual elements elevated and made this sequence so much bigger than it needed to be in regards to runtime. I feel like the scope, the scale, and the size, and you'll hear me repeat that a lot throughout this video, I believe those 3 elements were heavily impacted by just the choice of doing infrared cinematography here. I also think the transition between the indoor and outdoor, the black sun, all of that is brilliantly done, and I think the use of the visual cue of the moon and the sun works so well in this movie. It's mostly primarily done in the first act of the film, but I think it works and gives a montage-like effect to us understanding Paul Atreides' adaptation with the Fremen. And again, I'll get into the story later in this video. I also will talk about a few book comparisons, as I am more knowledgeable on that more recently. But before I get into the story stuff, I do want to talk about my visual problem with this film, and I know this is going to be a crazy thing to say about Dune Part 2, but I think there was too much IMAX in this film. I think the difference between this and the first movie is that in the first movie, when you're going between CinemaScope and IMAX, it had a distinction of giving us a bigger scale with big sets, like literally in the beginning of the movie, to the dream sequences. When you switch from CinemaScope to IMAX, you get a big punch in the face in the best way possible. It feels like someone splashed your face with water. It feels like your eyes are opening to something that is bigger than life. In this movie, pretty much everything is in IMAX, and I really feel like the scale is lost. Another comparison I made was Hunger Games Catching Fire, where as the aspect ratio changes when they're going into the arena, it also changes whenever Katniss is leaving the arena. And that's another thing where they use the IMAX aspect ratio to enhance the film. Here, I love IMAX. It's massive, it's big, it's huge, it really pops in your face. but with those intimate moments, it really feels like they're having a disregard for these characters. It feels like it's all for scale and scope and size. And I feel like in some movies that works. In Oppenheimer, it works in my opinion. The technological elements are there to aid everything from the black and white IMAX film to the regular IMAX film to choosing to film in a Panavision camera for some parts of the intimate moments between characters. All of those things work really, really well, but here it feels like the use of IMAX was more of a cop-out. It felt like, okay, we set up this world in the first movie, but at the end of the day, you're not really using IMAX to its advantage of putting us into this new world, because yes, we're already in this world. That doesn't mean that the scale and scope and size is lost. That doesn't mean that you don't still need to wow us with the epic nature of this world. But on a more positive note, I do want to transition into talking about the physical craft about this movie, because that's one thing that I think really not just improved from the last movie, but really did feel like it had a world of its own. Because it's important to note this movie cost $190 million. The first one cost $165 million. And this is absurd, because when I hear a $300 million movie, I'm like, oh yeah, it's gonna look like Dune Part 1 and Part 2. But we recently found out that Joker 2 is gonna cost upwards of $200 million, Gladiator 2 upwards of $300 million, and don't even start with me about the Marvel movies that are consistently upwards of $200 million, but look like shit. With this film, the costumes, the sets, it's all perfect. The attention to detail is brilliant. And honestly, the most recent films that come to mind that have a distinct, perfectly crafted nature to me is The Batman, Oppenheimer, Dune Part 1, and then Dune Part 2. As much as I can complain and bitch about the IMAX ratio and how much it was pissing me off about the scale and the transition and such, I can't deny pure talent when it comes to dedication of making a film. And Denis Villeneuve, and I will say, again, one of my favorite directors of all time, he doesn't miss with this one in regards to how tangible everything really feels. I can feel the touch of every costume. I can feel the fire. It feels hot on my face. The sand, it's coarse and rough and irritating. It's real. It all feels real to me. But speaking of the craft, I want to talk about the chilling score in this film, because the instant reminder that a sequence in this movie gave me was to the Trinity test in Oppenheimer, and this is in the duel between Fade and Paul at near the end of the movie in the third act, where basically the entirety of this movie is peaking. I'll talk about that scene more later in this video, but the score is completely silent. There's no epic nature to it. I mean, in Fade's introduction, the score is absolutely blaring. It's shaking your seat. The sandworm ride, everything with the score is beautiful throughout the entirety of this film. And I like to make this comparison just because it's the peak of what recent scores have been. Ludwig Göransson with Oppenheimer. It's a score that feels too quick to be real. And here you get that same nature. It's so grand that you couldn't possibly think a real orchestra could play this. But then in those moments where you're like, holy shit, it's about to peak, there is no noise. It is complete silence. And it's brilliant in my opinion. It works so well, and it truly... it makes your heart sink. It makes your hand cover your mouth. It makes your jaw go on the floor. These moments are moments that you build up for, and truly it does feel deserved here. The score is such an additive element to that. But now to get to pretty much the chunkiest part of this entire film, and that is the amazing performances through and through. Firstly, I have to say this cast is going band for band in the conversation of hottest lineup of all time. But I want to get through a couple of these before getting into the absolute big hitters. We have Javier Bardem as Stilgar. He was really great in the first movie, but in this movie, the glazing was absolutely insane. He was riding. It was insane to see that faith. And honestly, I'll get into the story elements later in this video. As I mentioned before, a lot of the religious elements of this film really did connect with me. And Stilgar felt like that connection. He felt like that passageway. And then we have Josh Brolin as Gurney. I actually didn't know that Gurney was still alive until I saw the first trailer for this movie. I kind of wish I didn't know. I love that sequence of him and Paul meeting for the first time. I actually get to see it ahead of rewatching Tenet in theaters, and that absolutely blew me away. I will say that sequence itself is one of the uses of IMAX where I'm like, okay, that looks epic as when I watch it in IMAX in front of Tenet, because not all of Tenet is in IMAX. And then you realize that the whole movie is shot like that, so it decreases the value a little bit. But nevertheless, I think Gurney's story is really interesting. And then we have Dave Bautista as Beast Robin. Oh my god, this is an amazing performance. I still think his career best performance is in Blade Runner 2049 personally, but this is an easy second, and he barely gets any screen time. It definitely feels like obviously he has more of an impact in this one than in the last one, just because obviously he's competing with Fade here, and I think that storyline is just so interesting. It's absolutely awesome how the power between the Harkonnens is transferred and how they're trying to like shoot for the throne. I really like all that kind of stuff. Then we have Stellan Skarsgård as the Baron. Holy shit. I mean, he goes crazy. It's just like this amalgamation of weird ass power, and just it's this power that's not there, but you feel it. I love it so much. Then you have Lea Seydoux as Margot Fenring, and I really wanted more of her in this movie. I mean, the Bene Gesserit as a whole were really, really cool to me, and I'm going to talk about the Bene Gesserit at the end of this video, because I do want to talk about Dune Messiah, the Sisterhood HBO Max show. I'm really excited for the future of stuff, so I'll save my thoughts on the Bene Gesserit as a whole for that. And then we have probably one of the more anticipated additions to this cast, Christopher Walken as Emperor Shaddam.
Your father was a weak man.
I think that the role of the Emperor was a little disappointing in this film, but I learned from my friend who read the book that he's not even a big part of the book, so I don't really know why I had that kind of expectation, but I think the performance is very simple, but when it's paired with Florence Pugh, works very, very well. And then we have Rebecca Ferguson as Lady Jessica. This does definitely deserve its own spot just in regards to the impact of a story, but again, I'll get to story later. Performance alone, this is brilliant. She has such a bigger impact on the story than I ever thought she would. I kind of thought that it was going to be a lot more dialed down in this film, but she genuinely puts on a show here. From the second that she drinks, you know what I'm saying if you've seen the movie, the second that happens, this character is completely transformed. Honestly, she transcends every other character in this film, in my opinion, just in regards to she is the Messiah before the Messiah. She understands what's going to happen before it happens, and she knows that she has to put a plan into place. And I find that as a character just to be really, really cool. And then sadly, I do have to throw in a little bit of a rut here when talking about the characters, because there are two very lackluster characters in my opinion. I want to start off with the very small one, and this is going to be very slight spoilers for the movie. She is a much bigger part of the books, apparently, according to my friend, but I want to talk about his sister. I want to talk about Paul's sister. In the book, she is a more prominent character in regards to the final act of this film, and that also has to do with a 2-year time jump. And I'll talk about the time jump in just a second here, because there's other things that are big implications of the time jump that weren't included in this movie. But Alia as a character, Paul's sister, was lackluster to me. I enjoyed what we got, but now knowing what is possible for us, or what was possible for us to get, I wish we had gotten more of her. And then secondly for me is Chani. Zendaya, I wasn't ever really convinced of this relationship. It wasn't very palpable to me from the get-go of this film. The one sequence where Timothée and Zendaya are sitting above the dune, looking out, and he's talking about, I want to be equal to you, that sequence works really, really well. But that sequence doesn't feel like the relationship that we're watching for the entirety of this film. Even in the first movie, I think what was so interesting about Chani was the fact that she was such a mysterious love interest, and we knew that they were going to be sticking together through this big holy war thing, because we didn't know about Princess Irulan at the time. And I do believe that the time jump would have really solidified this relationship, and again, I'll talk about that in a second, but this relationship was never really palpable for me. But getting into the absolute big hitters of this movie, I want to start off with Florence Pugh as Princess Irulan. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong, but Florence Pugh was absolutely awesome in this movie, and she barely has any screen time. Her facial acting is some of the best in the game right now, in my opinion. She is absolutely killing it, and she barely had any screen time in this movie. It felt like a Jason Momoa role, except Jason Momoa was more of a comedic relief. Like, I definitely think Stilgar took that side of it in this film, but Princess Erlan, she had such a minimal role, yet she was still so convincing, and all those things with, I think, her diaries, that was a brilliant thing to do in this film. But on top of that, like, for example, the scroll scene where Christopher Walken's character drops the scroll and then she reads it, I think that is brilliant. Again, not to get into spoilers about what the scroll contains, I think her connection with the Bene Gesserit and the way that all of these things about the Bene Gesserit and the bloodlines and the impact, the just intuition of the sisterhood and stuff like that, like, they know what they need to do, and Florence Pugh plays that character like no other. And then we have Austin Butler as Fade Routha, I think that's how you pronounce his name, as a character in and of himself. And the way that Austin Butler portrays this character, absolutely amazing in my opinion. I think the voice is just distinct enough, but it's not too weird.
Deal with this prophet. Show me who you are.
My only problem with Fade is that Austin Butler's feud with this character, like in that final duel scene, I'm trying to avoid spoilers here. In that final duel scene, I was obviously constantly rooting for Paul, even though I was seeing the villainous aspects of him coming out. Fade is obviously more evil, so I'm rooting against Fade. Austin Butler's performance never made me be like, holy shit, I hate this dude. It was more like a, who's a worse person, Fade or Paul? But at this point in this story, that's not what the problem should be. But then we get to Timothée Chalamet. Oh my god. So, I don't know where to start with this. I will say I'm going to be ranking all of Timothée Chalamet's filmography very, very soon, so stay tuned on the channel for that. But this is the Timothée Chalamet performance for me personally, where it feels like he plays his normal self for the first act of this film. The second act, or I will say at least when he becomes like the Lisan al-Gaib and he embodies all of these things, that's when he becomes a person that is not recognizable as Timothée Chalamet. Like, like, he's a silly guy, he's a silly goose. I was scared of this guy. Like, I was genuinely like, holy shit.
Consider what you're about to do, Paul Atreides.
Silence!
I could see this guy taking over the galaxy. I didn't see that in the first movie. I didn't see that even in the first act of this film. But as this movie transitioned, his performance evolves like no other. I've genuinely, I've seen amazing performances in movies. Like, in the full duration of a movie, a performance has been absolutely amazing. I've really never seen a movie that packs such a punch with the performance in regards to he is a completely different person by the end of this film, and one that if you only watch the second act of this film or second and third act of this film, you wouldn't believe that that guy was the person in the first 10 minutes of this movie, let alone a whole 2 hour and 30-minute movie that came out 3 years ago. He yells out at one point, "I will lead you to paradise." And that was like, wow. I don't see an actor anymore. I see a character, and that's hard to do. Performances, and honestly, all technical stuff aside now, I definitely want to get into the story/pacing. Obviously, I have to start off with the pacing just because this is a 2 hour and 46-minute movie, and the first act feels really, really long, but after that, it pretty much blows by for me, and this is very similar to the first movie, in my opinion, just in regards to, the pacing of, like, how each act feels, but also really the contents of the acts themselves, right? The first act in the first movie, it's Paul's life on Caladan and adapting to life on Arrakis. In the second movie, it's Paul's life with the Fremen and adapting with the Fremen. In the second act, for the first movie, it's the Harkonnen invasion. And in the second movie, it's introducing the Harkonnen lore and expanding upon the Emperor. This is where we get introduced to Princess Erlan's Bene Gesserit history along with the Fade stuff. And then the third act is in the first film where we get Paul's adaptation to the desert and dueling for his spot on the Fremen. And then the second movie is Paul's adaptation to really becoming a messiah and dueling for his spot on the throne. Now, I'm gonna get into the story elements of this film, and this will include spoilers for the book, which does mean it will contain spoilers for the movie, technically, if you haven't read the book yet. So if you're like me and you haven't read the book yet, you can skip to the timestamp on the screen right now to get nothing spoiled for you at all whatsoever. Now, I do have some things listed down, just big story moments that I want to talk about, because I cannot talk about the entire 2-hour and 46-minute movie. But my biggest like plot twist thing in this film was Paul is a Harkonnen. Like, that was f***ing insane. It doesn't shift the story, it shifts the character. I never really felt any tension when Paul died and came back to life. This is like really what kicks off this final part of the movie. And that moment, I felt like I was supposed to feel more just because of this relationship between Chani and Paul. But that relationship, again, was never really palpable for me. So that moment where Chani has to put her tears into the stuff, like, it doesn't really do much for me. Anyways, I will say Lady Jessica's story in this film was really, really interesting to me, because like I said in the very beginning of this video, I thought Lady Jessica wasn't going to be in this movie much. Like, I didn't really know what to expect in regards to her role, but her becoming the Reverend Mother was absolutely insane. Like, I really wasn't expecting that, and it really, really brings together the tension between Paul becoming the Lisan al-Gaib, the stuff with Chani and the religious elements. I think all of that comes together really, really well. And obviously with Lady Jessica also comes the stuff about Paul's sister, and I am going to talk about that cameo. So Anya Taylor-Joy is playing Alia, which is Paul's sister. And honestly, I found it very interesting, but I will say, like, I wish they did use the 2-year time jump from the book, because I felt like there was so much more they could have done and so much more impact they could have had. My biggest problem with this story is the fact that from the moment that Paul becomes the Lisan al-Gaib, there is really no like palpable tension between the scenes. Like, everything feels like it just runs and runs and runs, and that's okay in an anthological, I don't even know if that's a word, in an anthology-like series of events, which is what this movie feels like from the very beginning. But when you get to these moments that feel like they're supposed to be very tension-filled, from scene to scene, location to location, set to set, with the 2-year time jump in the book, that gives us Paul's son with Chani, which in my opinion would have made the love a lot more believable. But also, Alia is like 3 years old in the book at that point, and she ends up killing the Baron. I think that 2-year time jump, all of the elements that it brings in, now again, I don't know how that's going to impact the first act of this film, but all of the tension that it brings us within character things, that really could have fixed the transition between scene to scene, in my personal opinion. And the final thing I want to talk about is just the idea of following in this movie. I know that's a weird like chapter of my review, but at the end of the day, what I do appreciate about this film and why I think it'll go up from the rating that I'm about to give it at the end of this video is because I have truly been a guy that has struggled with this idea of mass following one person. Like, that is a crazy concept to me. And I understand that honestly, a majority of the world believes in this. And this movie really, really hit the nail on the head with that. It genuinely was this riveting tale of a messiah and these believers and these non-believers. And that's where I'm like, I don't give a shit about what you changed. I don't care what Denis changed from the book. This story is real while being so unfathomably unreal. I was not expecting Dune Part 2 to be a tale about the masses following one, yet that's where this movie flourishes. That's where it gives us the best of the best, in my personal opinion. Nevertheless, that wraps up my thoughts on Dune Part 2. Dune Part 2 is an absolutely sweeping epic. It puts the word epic to shame. It has so many highs, but honestly, I will say, sometimes the highs are too high. Sometimes it takes away from the personable elements, but at the end of the day, I think the performances are also all amazing. Visually, yes, it is a feast, and as a whole, I am super excited for Dune Messiah, Dune 3, whatever Denis is going to be cooking, I will be seated. Overall, I'm going to give Dune Part 2 a 9.25 out of 10. I know that's a pretty pretentious score, but at the end of the day, it is what it is. This movie is eventually probably going to make its way up to a 9.5, 10 out of 10. Again, if you've seen or want to check out Dune Part 2, let me know what you guys think about it in the comments down below. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Peace.